Isla, is the report I asked you for ready?
I'm finishing it up, sir.
The turbulence began as a minor annoyance, a gentle rhythmic shudder that was easy to ignore. Ayla Morin kept her focus on the laptop screen, the glow of a half-finished design proposal, a small island of normalcy in the sterile cabin of the Ashbourne Industries private jet. She could feel his presence across the aisle without looking. Sebastian Ashbourne, her boss, was a man who occupied space with the chilling efficiency of a glacier. He wasn't loud or ostentatious. He was simply there, a silent, gravitational force of tailored suits and gray eyes that seemed to assess everything for its value and find it lacking. The air around him always seemed a few degrees cooler, scented with the faint, clean smell of expensive woodsy cologne and freshly starched cotton. Then, the shudder changed. It wasn't rhythmic anymore. It was a violent, angry jolt that slammed Ayla against her seatbelt. Her laptop slid from her lap, crashing to the floor with a sickening crack. Her head snapped up. Across the aisle, Sebastian hadn't moved, but his knuckles were white where he gripped the armrests. His jaw was a hard, unforgiving line. A sound started low and guttural, a groan from the very bones of the aircraft. It was a sound of metal under a pressure it was never meant to endure. The gentle hum of the engines sputtered, coughed, and then one of them went silent. The sudden absence of noise was more chilling than any sound could have been. The plane dropped. It wasn't a fall. It was a void. One moment they were suspended in the calm, blue expanse of the sky. The next, the floor vanished from beneath them. Ayla's stomach launched into her throat, a hot, acidic wave of panic. A scream was trapped in her chest, a physical thing with claws. The world outside the window was no longer a serene landscape. It was a spinning, incomprehensible blur of green and blue, tilting at an impossible angle. The cabin erupted into pure chaos. A high-pitched alarm blared, a relentless, piercing shriek. The overhead compartments burst open, spilling jackets and bags like the guts of a wounded animal. The sound of metal screaming, twisting, and tearing apart was everywhere, a physical assault on her ears. It was the sound of the world ending. Ayla's hands flew to the armrests, her nails digging into the plush leather, searching for an anchor in a universe that had come unhinged. Her mind, usually a place of creative order, was a white-hot static of pure terror. This wasn't like the movies. There was no time for last words, no slow-motion descent, no moment for a final, desperate prayer. There was only the violent, brutal, all-consuming fall. She chanced to look across the aisle. Sebastian's eyes met hers. For a single terrifying heartbeat, the mask was gone. The cold CEO, the corporate predator, the man she secretly loathed, he had vanished. In his place was just a man, his eyes wide with the same stark, primal fear that was consuming her. It was a moment of raw, harrowing connection, a shared acknowledgement of the abyss that was about to swallow them whole. And then the world exploded in a concussion of force and sound. The impact was a physical blow that slammed the air from her lungs and rattled her teeth in her skull. There was a final, deafening roar of metal being shredded, and then, mercifully, everything went black. Silence. The silence was the first thing she registered. A profound, ringing quiet that was more disorienting than the noise had been. Ayla's head throbbed with a deep, percussive ache. She blinked, her vision swimming in and out of focus. A thick, coppery taste filled her mouth. Slowly, the scene resolved itself. Twisted metal, shattered glass. A thick tree branch impossibly had speared through the fuselage just inches from where her head had been. The sharp, acrid smell of jet fuel mingled with the damp, loamy scent of wet earth and crushed pine needles. She was alive. The realization didn't bring relief. It brought a fresh, suffocating wave of panic. Her lungs burned as she gasped for air, each breath a ragged, painful effort. Her hands trembled uncontrollably as she fumbled with the buckle of her seatbelt. It clicked open, and the simple sound was a gunshot in the dead quiet. She needed to get out. Now. She stumbled from her seat, her ribs screaming in protest. The floor was tilted at a grotesque angle, littered with the ghosts of their journey, a scattered deck of playing cards, an overturned champagne flute, a single leather shoe. She pushed her way through a gaping hole where a window used to be, her legs catching on torn wires and jagged metal. When she was finally free of the wreckage, her knees gave out, and she collapsed onto the damp, mossy ground. The forest was dense, a towering, indifferent cathedral of green. It was alive, breathing around her, and utterly, terrifyingly unknown. That's when she heard it. A low groan. Human. Ayla's head snapped toward the sound, her heart hammering against her ribs. A few yards away, slumped against the base of an ancient oak tree, was Sebastian Ashbourne, her boss. The man whose cold indifference had been the bane of her professional life for 2 years. He was bleeding. The impeccable navy suit he always wore, the one that served as his corporate armor, was torn at the shoulder. A deep gash on his forehead wept a steady stream of blood that traced a path down his temple and dripped from his jaw onto the dark soil. But it wasn't the blood that shocked her. It was his expression. For the first time since she had joined Ashbourne Industries, Ayla saw him stripped of his power. The formidable fortress had crumbled. He wasn't issuing orders. He wasn't scowling with that familiar, icy disapproval. He was just breathing, raggedly, fighting to anchor himself back in the world. His eyes found hers, and a current of raw recognition passed between them. It wasn't relief. It wasn't gratitude. It was the stark, shared knowledge of what they had just survived. "Are you hurt?" His voice was a rough rasp, but it was focused. There was no panic in it, only a tightly controlled urgency. Ayla blinked, the sound of his voice pulling her back from the edge. I don't think so." Her own voice was a thin, reedy thing, a stranger's voice. Sebastian tried to push himself up, his body betraying him as he swayed. On pure instinct, Ayla scrambled to her feet and rushed to his side, her hands grabbing his arm to steady him. A rush shot through her before she could even understand why. She had never touched him before. Not a handshake, not a brush in the hallway. The fabric of his suit was rough under her fingers, his arm beneath it hard as stone. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. They stood there for a moment, suspended in the eerie quiet of the forest, the sounds of birds and the whisper of wind through the canopy slowly returning. Sebastian's gaze swept the area, his mind already working. Ayla could see it in his eyes, the shift from victim to strategist. "We need to check for other survivors," he said, his voice regaining a fraction of its natural authority. But it was different. It wasn't an order. It was a statement of fact, almost a request for her to agree. Ayla nodded, her mind still reeling. Together they moved through the wreckage, calling out names that were answered only by the echoing silence. There was no one, just the two of them. As the crushing reality descended, Ayla felt the ground tilt beneath her feet again. They were alone, stranded in a wilderness with no communication, no sign of rescue, and the only other soul for miles was the man she was sure she could never stand. Sebastian turned to her, wiping a smear of blood from his brow with the back of his torn sleeve. His gaze met hers, and for the first time, Ayla saw something that frightened her more than the fall. It was pure, unyielding determination. "We are going to survive this," he said, his voice low but solid as bedrock. "I promise you." And in that moment, Ayla realized a dreadful, undeniable thing. She believed him. And honestly, who wouldn't? After surviving something like that, you'd believe anyone who promised you a way out. Let's see if he can keep that promise. The fire was the first miracle. Ayla watched, a sense of profound disbelief washing over her, as Sebastian Ashbourne knelt on the damp forest floor. He moved with a focused, almost surgical precision, stripping bark from a dry branch with a shard of metal from the wreckage, gathering tinder with an economy of motion that was mesmerizing. These were the same hands she had only ever seen gliding over an iPad to approve multi-million-dollar contracts or typing curt, dismissive emails that could end a career in under 10 words. Now, they were smudged with dirt, scratched and raw, working to coax life from friction and wood. He didn't complain. He didn't even sigh in frustration. He just worked.
How do you know how to do that?
The question slipped out before she could stop it, her voice sounding small in the vast quiet of the woods. He didn't look up, his concentration absolute. The muscles in his forearm tensed under the rolled-up sleeve of his ruined shirt as he began to rub a spindle against a fireboard he had fashioned.
My father.
He answered, his voice neutral, a low rumble against the whisper of wood on wood.
He believed a man should know how to survive with nothing but what the world gave him.
A wisp of smoke, thin and gray, curled upwards. Ayla held her breath. Sebastian leaned in, blowing gently, protectively. A tiny spark glowed, an ember of impossible hope in the twilight. Then another, and suddenly, a small, fragile flame flickered to life, dancing between his cupped hands. He looked at the flame for a long moment, and in the soft, golden light, Ayla saw the tension in his shoulders ease by a fraction. He had brought light back into the darkness. I have to say, for a guy she hated so much, he was proving to be surprisingly useful, wasn't he? They established a crude camp near the wreckage, a small pocket of order against the encroaching chaos of the wilderness. Sebastian orchestrated everything with a chilling efficiency that was both alien and deeply reassuring. He salvaged a large, partially intact piece of the cabin's interior lining, and with a length of wire he'd stripped from a seat, he rigged a makeshift lean-to between two thick trees. Ayla tried to help, to be useful, but she felt clumsy and out of her depth. Every task she thought of, he was already 3 steps ahead. She gathered wood, but he had already found a fallen log that was drier. She tried to sort through the salvageable items, but he had already prioritized water, shelter, and warmth. "Do you know how to tie a taut-line hitch?" he asked suddenly, holding up a length of cord he had scavenged. "Not exactly," she admitted, feeling a familiar flush of inadequacy. "It's all right. I'll show you." And he did. He stood behind her, his voice low and patient as he guided her hands through the loops and pulls. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body, a stark contrast to the cooling air. The scent of wood smoke now clung to him, mingling with that faint, expensive cologne that was somehow still there. His fingers brushed against hers as he adjusted the knot, and a jolt, sharp and unexpected, shot up her arm. She pulled her hand back as if burned. "Why are you being like this?" The words tumbled out, raw and unfiltered. He paused, his hands stilling on the rope. He turned his head slightly, his profile sharp against the deepening shadows. "Like what?" "So different." Sebastian let go of the rope and turned to face her fully. For a long moment, he just looked at her, his gray eyes unreadable in the flickering firelight. Then, he let out a slow breath and sat on a log near the fire. "In the office, I am what the board expects me to be," he said, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "What my uncle molded me into after my parents died." He paused, the name of his uncle hanging in the air like a chill. "Here, there's no room for that. There are no board members, no stock prices. There is only this." He gestured vaguely at the dark, looming trees around them. "Only survival." That night, the temperature plummeted. A cold, damp chill seeped from the ground, relentless and invasive. Ayla huddled by the fire, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. But the shivering was a deep, internal tremor she couldn't control. She bit her lip, refusing to complain, refusing to show the weakness she felt. But he noticed. Of course he noticed. Sebastian Ashbourne noticed everything. Without a word, he stood up, took off his torn suit jacket, the last remaining layer he had, and walked over to her. He held it out. "No!" she protested immediately, her teeth chattering. "You'll freeze." "I'm warmer than you are." It was a simple statement of fact. Sebastian. Ayla. His voice was firm, cutting through her protest, but it lacked its usual icy edge. It was just certain. Please. She looked up at him, at the genuine concern etched onto his face, a face she had only ever seen set in a mask of cool authority. And something inside her shifted, a tectonic plate of long-held animosity grinding into a new position. Slowly, her hands reached out and took the jacket. She pulled it over her shoulders. The fabric was still warm from his body, and it carried his scent, smoke, the forest, and something uniquely, indefinably him. It felt like a shield. He gave a single sharp nod and returned to his spot on the other side of the fire, rubbing his arms against the cold. Ayla watched him, a painful knot tightening in her chest. It was a confusing tangle of guilt, gratitude, and something else, something warmer and far more dangerous. "Thank you," she whispered across the flames. He just inclined his head, his eyes already heavy with an exhaustion so profound it seemed to weigh him down. Ayla couldn't sleep. She watched the fire spit and crackle, a lone beacon against the oppressive living darkness of the forest. And she watched Sebastian. He was shivering. He was trying to hide it, his movements small and controlled, but in the stark, dancing light of the fire, she could see the tremors running through his body. Before she could second-guess the impulse, before logic could intervene, she was on her feet. Clutching the jacket, she walked around the fire and sat down beside him. The ground was cold and hard beneath her. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice thick with sleep, his eyes still closed. "Sharing." She draped the jacket over both of them, a makeshift blanket, huddling close enough that their shoulders and hips pressed together. The shared space was instantly warmer. Sebastian's eyes opened. They were dark pools in the firelight, reflecting the flames. He looked at her, then at the jacket covering them, then back at her. "You don't have to do that." "I know." A heavy silence fell, filled only by the sound of the fire and the distant call of some nocturnal creature. Then, so slowly she almost didn't feel it, he leaned into her, a subtle shift of weight, an acceptance, a surrender. Ayla's heart began to beat a heavy, frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was acutely aware of every point of contact, his shoulder against hers, his thigh against hers, the steady, solid presence of him. She hated Sebastian Ashbourne. She had built 2 years of her professional life around the certainty of that hatred. It was a solid, dependable thing. But the man shivering beside her, the man who had given her his last layer of warmth, the man who was now trusting her enough to lean on her, she had to admit she had no idea who that man was. And as she sat there, sharing a jacket and a sliver of warmth under a canopy of unfamiliar stars, an impossible, terrifying thought began to bloom in the darkness of her mind. She wasn't sure she hated him at all anymore. Ayla woke to the smell of roasting fish and the alien sound of birdsong. For a disorienting moment, her mind clung to the memory of her warm bed, her small apartment, the familiar city sounds. Then, the reality of her situation returned with a jolt. The dull ache in her back from sleeping on the hard ground, the chill in the air, the heavy weight of Sebastian's jacket still draped over her. She sat up, her movements stiff. Across the dying embers of the fire, Sebastian was crouched by a small, clear stream she hadn't noticed before. He was turning 2 small, silver-skinned fish skewered on green branches over a fire he'd somehow coaxed back to life from the night's embers. "You fished?" The words came out raspy. He glanced over his shoulder, and for the first time, Ayla saw something she would have sworn was impossible on the face of Sebastian Ashbourne. A smile. It wasn't his corporate, predatory smile. This one was small, hesitant, almost shy. It barely touched his lips, but it lit his eyes. "Woke up early," he said, his voice still rough from sleep. "Found the stream about 200 yards that way." Ayla blinked, pushing her tangled hair out of her face. "And you?" You caught fish? With your hands? Improvisation, he said simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He lifted one of the sticks from the fire, the fish sizzling, its skin perfectly crisped. Eat. We need the energy. They fell into an unspoken routine, a rhythm dictated by the sun and their shared need to survive. It was a strange, silent partnership. Sebastian, with his relentless focus, took charge of securing the camp and exploring for a way out. He was the hunter, the protector. Ayla, who had a degree in graphic design but a secret lifelong passion for botany passed down from her grandmother, became the gatherer. And just like that, they weren't boss and employee anymore. They were something else entirely, something forged by necessity. It's amazing what people can become when the world falls away, isn't it? She began to explore the flora around them, her grandmother's lessons echoing in her mind. She found broad, waxy leaves that, when layered, could help waterproof their lean-to. She identified edible roots, painstakingly cross-referencing them with the memories of sketches in her grandmother's old notebooks. She even found a plant with soft, pulpy leaves that she knew had antiseptic properties. "How do you know all this?" Sebastian asked later that day. He was sitting patiently on a log while she cleaned the gash on his forehead, which was beginning to look angry and inflamed. "My grandmother," Ayla answered softly, her focus entirely on the task. She had crushed the leaves into a green paste, just as she'd been taught. She believed nature has an answer for everything, if you just know where to look. He was quiet as she worked, so still that it made her own racing heart feel ridiculously loud in the silence. She was so close, closer than she had been even when he'd taught her the knot. She could feel the warmth of his skin, see the faint stubble shadowing his jaw, the tiny, almost invisible scar just above his eyebrow she'd never noticed before. She saw the vulnerability in the way his eyes tracked her movements. Her fingers were gentle as she applied the poultice to his skin. When she finished, her hand lingered for a fraction of a second too long, her thumb brushing against his temple. His breath hitched. Their eyes met. The air between them, already thin at this altitude, suddenly felt thick, charged with a new and unpredictable current. Ayla pulled her hand back quickly, her heart hammering against her ribs, and took a step away. Later that afternoon, while gathering a fresh supply of firewood deeper in the woods, Sebastian stopped dead. He held up a hand, his body instantly alert. "Listen." Ayla froze, her own senses straining. "What is it?" The silence. She focused, and then she understood. The constant chatter of birds had ceased. The rustle of small animals in the undergrowth was gone. The entire forest had gone unnervingly still. It wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was an unnatural one, like the world was holding its breath. "Sebastian," she whispered. A strange shiver ran down her back, as if her body knew before her mind did. "Stay behind me." He didn't have to say it twice. Ayla moved, her back pressing against his as he scanned the dense trees around them. And then they saw it. Imprinted in a patch of soft mud near the stream were paw prints. They were huge, larger than her own hand, with deep, menacing claw marks pressed into the earth. "What kind of animal leaves a track that big?" Ayla's voice was a choked whisper. Sebastian knelt, his fingers hovering over the edge of the print, his expression grim. "Something large, feline." He didn't need to finish the sentence. They both knew what roamed the deep woods in this part of the world. Cougar, panther. They returned to the camp in a tense, hurried silence. Sebastian didn't speak, but his actions were loud. He built the fire up, creating a larger, more formidable circle of light. He took the sharpest piece of metal he had salvaged from the wreckage and began methodically honing its edge against a flat stone, crafting a crude but deadly-looking spear. "We'll take watches tonight," he said, his voice calm, but with an underlying firmness that left no room for argument. "I'll take the first shift. When I wake you, you take over." Ayla nodded, her mouth too dry to speak. But as night fell, wrapping the forest in a suffocating blanket of darkness, sleep was impossible. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves in the wind sent a jolt of adrenaline through her. Her imagination painted terrifying shapes in the shadows just beyond the fire's reach. And then she heard it. It was distant but unmistakable, a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath them. It was a sound of pure, predatory power. Ayla's eyes shot open. She sat bolt upright, her gaze darting to Sebastian. He was already on his feet, the makeshift spear held tight in his hand, his body a tense silhouette against the flames. His eyes were locked on the impenetrable darkness beyond their camp. "Don't move," he whispered, his voice a low command that barely disturbed the air. Ayla held her breath, her body paralyzed with fear. And then, for a split second, she saw them. Two yellow eyes, glowing like embers in the pitch black, reflecting the firelight. They were watching, calculating. The Black Panther. Sebastian shifted his body, a single deliberate movement that placed him squarely between Ayla and the unseen threat. He became a wall of flesh and bone against the coming darkness. "If I tell you to run," he said, his voice low and lethal, his eyes never leaving the spot where the eyes had been. "You run. Do you understand?" "I'm not leaving you, Ayla." He turned his head just enough for her to see his profile, carved from stone and shadow. "Promise me." Tears of terror burned at the back of her eyes, but before she could answer, the panther took a single, deliberate step out of the darkness, its sleek, powerful body emerging into the firelight. And Sebastian moved to meet it. Sebastian didn't charge with the spear. He attacked with fire. In one swift, fluid motion, he lunged toward the fire pit, grabbed a thick, burning branch, and hurled it into the darkness just in front of the panther. The log landed with a shower of sparks and a loud hiss, casting a wild, dancing light. The massive cat recoiled, a deep, furious snarl ripping from its chest, its yellow eyes blazing with indignation. "Get back!" Sebastian's voice was a raw, primal roar that tore through the forest, a sound so full of command and fury it seemed to shake the very trees. Ayla stared, frozen, as the man she knew as a cold, calculating CEO transformed into something elemental, something wild, a protector. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed another burning branch, then another, flinging them in a strategic arc, creating a flickering, temporary wall of fire between their small camp and the creature. The panther paced back and forth, its sleek, black body a ripple of muscle and menace. It was trapped between its predatory instinct and its primal fear of the flames. It let out one last frustrated roar, a sound that vibrated deep in Ayla's bones. And then, with a flick of its tail, it melted back into the shadows. It was gone. But Ayla knew, with a chilling certainty, it wasn't far. It was out there, waiting. The rest of the night was a waking nightmare. Sebastian did not sit. He did not rest. He stood sentinel at the edge of the firelight, the metal spear held tight in his grip, his eyes constantly scanning the oppressive darkness. He methodically fed the fire, keeping the flames high and bright, a solitary guardian against the terrors of the night. Ayla tried to stay awake with him, her own fear a sharp, bitter taste in her mouth. But the adrenaline crash, combined with days of physical and emotional exhaustion, was a tide she couldn't fight. Her head drooped. Her eyelids grew heavy, and eventually she slumped against a log and fell into a fitful, dream-haunted sleep filled with images of yellow eyes and glistening teeth. She woke to the soft gray light of dawn filtering through the canopy. The first thing she saw was Sebastian. He was still there, still standing, still awake. He was leaning against a tree now, the spear resting at his side, but his posture was rigid, his gaze still fixed on the surrounding woods. You didn't sleep?" Ayla scrambled to her feet, a pang of guilt and awe tightening her chest. "Couldn't risk it," he said, his voice rough and strained. "Sebastian, you have to rest. I'm fine." But the slight tremor in his hands and the dark, bruised look under his eyes told a different story. He pushed himself off the tree, and his exhaustion was plain to see. He swayed, catching himself with a hand against the rough bark. Ayla closed the distance between them, her hand instinctively going to his arm to steady him. "You're not fine. You need to sleep. I'll keep watch." "Ayla, you don't know. I know how to feed a fire, and I know how to scream." She met his gaze, her own expression firm, leaving no room for argument. "Let me take care of you, just for a few hours." He looked at her for a long, searching moment, his defenses warring with his body's desperate need for rest. Finally, with a slow, reluctant exhale, he gave a single, sharp nod. "A few hours. Only." He lay down near the fire, and Ayla expected him to be asleep before his head hit the bundled leaves she'd arranged as a pillow. But he wasn't. He lay there, his body still tense, his eyes half closed, his breathing shallow and uneven. "I can't," he admitted, his voice a low rasp of frustration. "I can't switch it off." Without thinking, without allowing herself to hesitate, Ayla sat down on the ground beside him. And then she did something that surprised them both. She reached out and took his hand. Sebastian went utterly still. His eyes flew open, wide and startled, locking onto hers. His hand was cold in hers, but it was strong, his long fingers calloused from his work during the night. "I'm right here," Ayla said softly, her voice a gentle anchor in the quiet morning. "Nothing is going to happen. I'll wake you if I see anything." He stared at their joined hands as if he'd never seen them before. Then, so slowly it was almost imperceptible, his fingers curled, lacing through hers. The connection was solid. Real. "Why are you doing this?" he whispered, his gaze lifting to her face. Ayla didn't have an answer that made sense. Or maybe she did, and that was what scared her. "Because you would do the same for me," she finally replied, the words feeling truer than anything she had said in years. A flicker of something, gratitude, surprise, relief, softened the hard lines of his face. And for the first time since the plane had fallen from the sky, he let his guard down completely. His eyes drifted shut, and with his hand held securely in hers, he finally slept. 3 hours later, Ayla was still sitting beside him, her back against a log, her own exhaustion a dull, distant ache. She watched the steady rise and fall of his chest. She noticed the way sleep smoothed the harsh lines of concentration from his face, making him look younger, almost vulnerable. She was still holding his hand, and she had no desire to let go. When Sebastian finally stirred, the sun was high in the sky, casting dappled light through the leaves. He blinked, disoriented, and the first thing he seemed to register was the warmth of her hand still holding his. He looked at their entwined fingers, then at her. She looked back at him. Neither of them moved to pull away. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with sleep and something else she couldn't quite name. "Always," Ayla heard herself say, the word feeling both reckless and right. In that quiet moment, something fundamental shifted between them. They weren't boss and employee anymore. They weren't even just partners in survival. They were something else, something more dangerous, something inevitable. Sebastian slowly pushed himself into a sitting position, but he didn't release her hand. "Ayla," he began, his voice serious, "I need to tell you something." Her heart gave a painful lurch. "What?" He opened his mouth, then closed it, struggling with the words. "Back at the office, the way I was." He paused, his gaze dropping to their hands. "I never wanted to be that person. Especially not with you. I didn't know how to be anything else." "Why?" she whispered. "Because my uncle taught me that caring is a weakness, that a leader can't be kind, that an Ashbourne can never show." He trailed off, his voice cracking on the last word. "Show what?" she prompted gently. Sebastian looked up, and in the raw, unguarded depths of his eyes, Ayla saw everything. The crushing loneliness, the weight of a legacy he never asked for. The cold, empty prison he had built around himself. That he cares, he finally said, and Ayla's world, which had already been turned upside down once, tilted on its axis all over again. That evening, the sky broke open. It wasn't a gentle rain. It was a deluge, a sudden violent downpour that hammered the forest canopy. The makeshift lean-to Sebastian had built shuddered under the assault, and within minutes, cold water began to drip, then stream through the gaps. The fire hissed and sputtered, fighting a losing battle against the onslaught before finally dying with a defeated sigh, plunging their small camp into a deeper, more profound darkness. They were soaked in seconds. A brutal, bone-deep cold set in, far worse than the night before. "We have to stay warm," Sebastian said, his voice tight, cutting through the roar of the rain. "Hypothermia is a real threat." He didn't wait for her to agree. He pulled her into the driest corner of the shelter, turning his back to the worst of the wind and wrapping his arms around her, pulling her tight against his chest. Ayla didn't resist. Her body was shaking uncontrollably, her teeth chattering so hard her jaw ached. His body, though also cold and wet, was a solid, living furnace against the storm. They huddled together, two survivors clinging to each other for warmth, the distinction between them dissolving in the shared, desperate need to endure. And in the roaring darkness, cocooned together against the storm, Sebastian began to talk. "My parents died when I was 15, he said, his voice a low, steady anchor against the chaos of the wind and rain. "Car accident. My uncle took me in. He took over the company, too." Ayla listened in silence, her ear pressed against his chest, feeling the vibration of his words as much as hearing them. Each word was a confession, a piece of a puzzle she was only just beginning to understand. "He told me I had to be strong, that the world was full of predators, and if I showed any weakness, they would tear me apart." He took a shaky breath. "So I learned. I learned to build walls. I learned to treat everything like a transaction. I learned to never, ever let anyone see that something, or someone, mattered." He shifted, his arms tightening around her. "At the office, you always looked at me like I was a monster." Ayla's chest ached. And you were right." He cut her off, his voice rough with self-loathing. "I was. My uncle always said it's better to be feared and respected than to be liked and seen as weak. Sebastian. But here." He lifted a hand, his cold fingers finding her cheek, his thumb stroking the line of her jaw. The simple, tender gesture was a stark contrast to the violence of the storm. "Here, I can't pretend anymore. And the truth is, I hate the man I became, but I don't know how to be anyone else." Ayla covered his hand with her own, pressing it against her face, holding it there. "Maybe you don't have to learn," she whispered. "Maybe you just have to remember. Remember the person you were before your uncle told you who to be." She paused, her eyes, even in the near-total darkness, trying to find his. The person who would face down a panther to protect someone. The person who would stay up all night in the cold. That's the real you, Sebastian. Not the machine in the suit. The world seemed to shrink to the tiny, fragile space they occupied. Sebastian stared down at her, his eyes searching her face for something. Permission, maybe. Or absolution. "I hated you," Ayla confessed suddenly, the words pouring out of her carried on the tide of the storm. "Back in that life, I hated you so much. You were cold and demanding, and you never once said thank you. I thought you were an empty suit, a man with no soul." She took a ragged breath. "But you're not. You're here, keeping me alive, teaching me, protecting me. And I don't know what to feel anymore. Because everything I thought I knew about you was wrong. Sebastian closed his eyes, a pained expression crossing his face as if her words were physical blows. Ayla, let me finish. She brought her other hand up, framing his face, forcing him to look at her. You are not the man I thought you were, and that terrifies me. Because now I see you. And you are. She struggled for the word. You're extraordinary. His breath hitched. I'm not. You are. Ayla, you don't understand. When we get back, if we get back, I have to be that man again. My uncle, the board, the company, they all expect, then don't go back, she said, her voice fierce. Not to that. Be this person. The real Sebastian, not the one the world demands. He looked at her as if she had just offered him the sun and the moon. And maybe she had. What if I don't know who the real Sebastian is anymore? He whispered, his vulnerability a raw, open wound. Ayla managed a small, gentle smile. My grandmother used to say that as long as you're breathing, you have time to figure it out. You just have to want to. The rain continued to fall, a steady rhythmic drumming on their shelter. But inside, a different storm was brewing. Sebastian leaned forward, his forehead coming to rest against hers. Their breaths mingled in the cold air. If I kiss you now, he said, his voice a hoarse, desperate rasp. There's no going back from it. I won't be able to pretend it didn't happen. Ayla's heart was beating so hard, she was sure he could feel it through her chest. Then don't pretend, she whispered against his lips. And Sebastian broke. He kissed her. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a kiss of desperation, of starvation, of a man who had been lost in a desert and had finally found water. It was raw and consuming, freighted with all the fear and hope and terror of the past few days. Ayla melted against him, her hands tangling in his wet hair, pulling him closer, meeting his desperation with her own. The kiss tasted of rain and survival, and everything they hadn't been able to say. When they finally pulled apart, breathless, he didn't let her go. He held her tight against his chest, as if she were the only solid thing in a world that had fallen apart. I don't want to be that man anymore, he murmured into her hair, his voice a solemn vow made to the storm. For the first time in my life, I want to choose. And that night, as the rain washed the world clean, two strangers became something more, something that neither the forest nor the world that waited for them could ever undo. When the rain finally stopped the next morning, leaving the forest washed clean and glistening, a new resolve had settled between them. The kiss had changed everything. The air was no longer thick with unspoken tension, but with the quiet, humming energy of a shared, undeniable truth. Sebastian was the first to break the silence. We can't stay here, he said, his eyes scanning the dense woods. We're too exposed, and we're running out of time. He looked toward the highest peak in the distance, a jagged silhouette against the pale morning sky. We have to get to high ground. If we can build a signal fire up there, a big one, we have a chance. A real chance. Ayla followed his gaze. The mountain looked impossibly far, its slopes steep and treacherous. Do you think we can make it? Sebastian turned to her, and his hand found hers, his fingers lacing through hers with a natural, possessive ease. Together, he said, the word a promise. Yes? That single word, together, sent a wave of warmth through her chest, chasing away the last of the morning chill. They spent the day preparing. The work was different now. It was a coordinated dance, no longer just him leading and her following. They moved around each other with an easy familiarity, their movements punctuated by small smiles and casual touches, a hand on a shoulder, fingers brushing as they passed a tool. Sebastian fashioned 2 makeshift backpacks from the salvaged cabin lining. They packed what little they had, a plastic bottle now filled with rainwater, the last of the edible roots Ayla had found, the crude spear, and the fire-starting kit. You're different, Ayla commented as she helped him adjust the strap on his pack. He paused, his gaze steady on her. You are too. She tilted her head. How? In the office, he said, his voice soft. You always seem to be holding your breath. You walked with your shoulders hunched, like you were trying to take up as little space as possible. His eyes softened, a gentle light warming their gray depths. Out here, you shine. Ayla felt a blush creep up her neck. Maybe that's because out here, I'm not just the invisible designer. I'm necessary. You were always necessary, Sebastian said, his voice low and serious. I was just too blind to see it. The first part of the journey was deceptively easy. The forest floor was relatively clear, and the incline was gentle. But as they began to ascend, the woods grew darker, the trees thicker, their ancient branches tangling together to form a dense canopy that blocked out the sun. The sounds of the forest changed, becoming more muted, more watchful. And then Ayla saw it. Sebastian. Her voice was a strangled whisper. He was instantly at her side, his body tense. What is it? With a trembling hand, she pointed to the ground. Half buried in the damp earth and moss was a bone. It was yellowed with age, cracked and weathered, but it was unmistakably human. A femur. Sebastian's blood ran cold. That can't be. But before he could finish the thought, his foot came down on something that didn't belong. Not a rock, not a root. There was a sharp, metallic click, and the world flipped upside down. Ayla screamed as Sebastian was violently yanked into the air, a thick rope snare tightening around his ankle. He was left dangling, suspended 3 meters from the ground, swinging like a pendulum. "Sebastian!" she shrieked, scrambling toward him. "No!" he yelled back, his voice strained with pain and a new, terrifying urgency. "Ayla! Get out of here! Run!" "What? I'm not leaving you!" And then she heard it. Drums. A steady rhythmic beat, distant at first, but growing closer with every frantic beat of her own heart. Sebastian's face, already pale, lost all color. "Ayla, listen to me. You have to hide. Now. Not without you. Please." His voice broke, a sound of pure desperation. "If they find you too, we have no chance. Hide. And don't come out until you're sure it's safe. I'll get out of this, I swear. I'll come back for you," she sobbed, her mind reeling. "I promise." "Ayla!" But she was already gone, scrambling behind a massive, gnarled tree, her body pressed flat against the rough bark. Her heart was pounding, almost trying to break free from her chest, a frantic counterpoint to the approaching drums. A cold sweat broke out across her skin. Her survival instincts, honed over the past week, were screaming at her. Danger, primal, human danger. The drumming grew louder, more insistent, and then they appeared, emerging from the trees like spirits of the forest. Figures adorned with crude paint and animal skins. Faces obscured by carved wooden masks that seemed to stare with hollow, lifeless eyes. They carried spears tipped with sharpened stone. A tribe. An uncontacted tribe. They surrounded the spot where Sebastian hung, their voices a low, guttural chant in a language Ayla had never heard. One of them poked the snare with the butt of his spear, making Sebastian swing. They laughed, a chilling, joyless sound. Then, with coordinated, practiced movements, one of them sliced through the rope with a stone knife. Sebastian fell to the forest floor with a sickening thud. Before he could even gasp for air, they were on him, binding his hands and feet with rough, fibrous cords. Ayla clamped a hand over her own mouth, stifling a scream. The tribesmen hoisted Sebastian onto their shoulders and began to march back the way they came, their drumming and chanting resuming. As they disappeared into the dense green, the last thing Ayla saw was Sebastian's face. He turned his head, his eyes desperately searching the trees until they found her hiding spot. His look wasn't one of fear. It was a silent, desperate command. Survive. Ayla didn't know how long she remained pressed against the tree, frozen. It could have been minutes or an hour. The world had shrunk to the sound of her own ragged breathing and the frantic, wild drumming of her heart against her ribs. He was gone. Taken. The forest, which had been a neutral, indifferent wilderness, now felt actively hostile, filled with a danger she couldn't fight. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. Her lungs burned, and no matter how deeply she gasped, it felt like she was breathing water. An anxiety attack. Her body was flooded with adrenaline, her instincts screaming at her to run, to hide, to disappear. But then, another image pushed through the terror. Sebastian, standing between her and the panther, his body a shield. Sebastian, awake all night, a solitary guardian. Sebastian, kissing her in the rain as if he were trying to memorize the feel of being alive. A fierce, protective rage, hotter than any fear, ignited in her soul. "I'm coming for you." The thought was a vow. She pushed herself away from the tree, her limbs trembling but obedient. She had to do something, and she had to do it now. Following the trail the tribe had left was terrifyingly easy. They had made no effort to hide their passage. Broken branches, deep impressions in the mud, the occasional discarded piece of fibrous cord, they moved through their forest with the confidence of apex predators. Every snap of a twig made Ayla flinch, her heart leaping into her throat. But she forced herself forward, one step at a time, her mind a mantra of Sebastian's face, his voice, his touch. She would save him, or she would die trying. The trail led her to the edge of a large, unnatural clearing. She dropped to her belly in the undergrowth, peering through a screen of ferns. What she saw made her breath catch. A village, not just a few huts, but a sprawling settlement of thatched roof structures, smoke curling from a dozen small fires, and people, dozens of them, moving about their daily tasks, their voices a low, alien hum. And in the very center of the village, tied to a thick wooden stake driven into the earth, was Sebastian. A sob escaped her lips, muffled by the damp soil. He was alive, bruised, a fresh cut bleeding sluggishly on his cheek, but alive. His head was bowed in exhaustion, but as she watched, he lifted it, his eyes scanning the tree line that bordered the village. He was looking for her. He was holding out hope that she had listened, that she was safe. "I'll get you out of there," Ayla whispered to the empty air, as if he could hear her. But how? She was one person. They were a village. She had a few sharpened sticks and a desperate plan. They had spears and numbers. She spent hours watching from the edge of the woods, her mind racing. She studied their patterns, the way the guards moved, the locations of the blind spots. And slowly, an idea began to form. It was insane. It was reckless. It was a plan born of pure desperation. But it was the only thing she had. She remembered a lesson from a long-forgotten anthropology class in college. Isolated tribes, superstitions, primal fears, and she remembered the panther. The same magnificent, terrifying creature that had nearly killed them. The same beast that had haunted their nights. Her professor had spoken of certain indigenous cultures that viewed black panthers not as animals, but as powerful, vengeful spirits. Ghosts of slain enemies returned to haunt the living. Ayla had no way of knowing if this tribe shared that belief, but it was her only card to play. She had to lure the panther. She had to bring the spirit of the forest to the village gates. Finding the panther was easier than she expected. Or perhaps the panther found her. She had circled back toward the stream, her heart pounding with a terrifying mix of purpose and dread. She was gathering a handful of small, hard river stones when she felt it. That sudden, oppressive weight in the air. That prickling on the back of her neck that screamed you are being watched. She turned, slowly, and there it was. Not 10 yards away, perched silently on a low-hanging branch, was the black panther. It watched her with an unnerving intelligence, its yellow eyes glowing, its tail twitching almost imperceptibly. Every muscle in Ayla's body screamed at her to run, to climb, to do anything but stand there, exposed and helpless. Instead, she did something that defied all logic and reason. She took one of the stones from her pocket, and she threw it. It wasn't a hard throw, not meant to injure. It was meant to insult. The stone bounced harmlessly off the branch a few inches from the panther's paw. The great cat let out a low, rumbling growl, a sound that vibrated through the soles of Ayla's feet. Its ears flattened against its skull. "That's it," Ayla whispered, her voice trembling as she began to back away slowly, deliberately in the direction of the village. "Come on, come with me." She threw another stone, this one landing closer. The panther dropped from the branch, landing on the forest floor with a silent, graceful thud. It took a step toward her, its lips curling back to reveal a flash of white, deadly teeth. And Ayla ran. She ran faster than she had ever run in her life, her lungs burning, her feet flying over roots and rocks. The sound of the panther's heavy paws pounding the earth behind her was a thunderous, terrifying drumbeat. Closer. Closer. She could feel its hot breath on her heels, could almost feel the phantom touch of its claws on her back. Then she saw it through the trees, the flickering orange light of the village fires. With a final, desperate burst of speed and a scream that ripped from the very depths of her soul, Ayla burst out of the tree line and into the clearing, right into the heart of the village. The panther, blinded by its hunting rage, followed a second behind her, and chaos erupted. The village exploded into pure, primal panic. The tribespeople didn't see an animal. They saw a nightmare made flesh. A demon of shadow and claw, a vengeful spirit of the forest unleashed in their midst. Screams tore through the air, figures scattered in every direction, tripping over cooking pots and each other in their desperate flight. The panther, momentarily confused by the sudden eruption of noise and movement, spun in a circle, its snarling roar echoing the terror of the villagers. In the chaos, Ayla was invisible. Just another shadow moving through the bedlam. It was perfect. Keeping low to the ground, she darted between the huts, her eyes locked on her single objective. Sebastian. He had seen her. His eyes were wide with a mixture of disbelief and sheer terror. "What have you done?" he breathed, as she skidded to a halt at the stake, her fingers already clawing at the thick fibrous ropes that bound him. "Saving you," she panted, her nails scraping uselessly against the tight knots. "Now hold still." "You're insane! That thing will kill you!" "It's a little busy at the moment," she grunted, abandoning her nails and trying to work her fingers under the coarse rope. The knots were complex, pulled brutally tight. Ayla's hands shook, her fingers slick with sweat and grime, making the task nearly impossible. "Come on, come on, come on," she muttered, a frantic prayer under her breath. The panther let out another earth-shaking roar, this one closer. "Ayla, leave me," Sebastian urged, his voice strained. "Save yourself." "Shut up and let me work," she snapped, a surge of adrenaline giving her new strength. Finally, the main knot began to give. She pulled, and it loosened. Then the second. Sebastian wrenched his hands free and immediately began working on the ropes at his ankles. A moment later, he was up, grabbing her hand. "Run!" And they ran. The dark forest swallowed them whole, a protective embrace of shadow and leaves. Branches whipped at their faces, and unseen roots threatened to send them sprawling, but they didn't slow. They ran, fueled by fear and a desperate shared will to live. The sounds of the panicked village and the enraged panther growing fainter and fainter behind them. They ran until their lungs burned like they were filled with fire. They ran until their legs were numb, leaden weights they had to force forward. They ran until the sounds of the village were nothing more than a distant, fading echo. When they finally collapsed, it was in a small, hidden hollow miles away. They fell to the ground, gasping for air, their bodies trembling with exhaustion and the aftermath of adrenaline. "You," Sebastian started, still struggling to breathe. "You lured a black panther to save me?" Ayla let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. It seemed like a good idea at the time. He stared at her, his chest heaving. And then, without warning, he surged forward, pulling her into an embrace so fierce it squeezed the remaining air from her lungs. He buried his face in her hair, his arms a steel cage around her. "You are absolutely insane," he murmured against her scalp. "I learned from the best," she managed to gasp into his shoulder. He pulled back just enough to look at her, his hands framing her face, his thumbs stroking her dirt-smudged cheeks. "You could have been killed. So could you." "Exactly. Why would you risk—" Ayla silenced him by pressing her palms against his cheeks. "Because you would have done the same for me," she said, her voice low and steady. "Because we're partners in this, and partners don't leave each other behind." Sebastian's eyes glistened with something that looked devastatingly like tears. "Partners," he repeated, the word full of a new, profound weight. They made camp far from the village, a cold camp with no fire. It was too risky. There was only the darkness, the quiet hum of the forest, and each other. Ayla sat with her back against the rough bark of a tree, Sebastian beside her, their shoulders and hips pressed together for warmth and comfort. "I thought I'd lost you," she confessed into the darkness, the words barely a whisper. Sebastian's hand found hers, his fingers lacing through hers, a silent, solid reassurance. The silence stretched, comfortable and deep, and then, so quietly she almost thought she'd imagined it. He spoke. "I love you, Ayla." The world stopped. The forest, the darkness, the fear. It all vanished. Ayla turned her head so fast she felt a crick in her neck. "What?" He met her gaze, his face a landscape of raw vulnerability in the faint starlight. "I love you. I think I have since the moment you woke up after the crash, and I saw you were alive, the moment I knew I wasn't alone." He gave a small, self-deprecating smile, which is ironic, because the truth is I've always felt alone. "Sebastian, you don't have to say it back," he said quickly, his voice thick with emotion. I needed you to know, because if we don't make it out of this." Ayla kissed him. She poured every ounce of fear, relief, and soaring, terrifying love she felt into it. It was a kiss that sealed every unspoken promise, every shared glance, every moment of sacrifice. When they finally broke apart, she was smiling through tears. "I love you too," she whispered. "Now please try not to get captured by a homicidal tribe ever again." He laughed, a real, genuine sound of relief that echoed in the quiet hollow. "I'll do my best." And that night, in the heart of a dangerous, unknown wilderness, miles from civilization, with a hostile tribe somewhere behind them, and no guarantee of rescue, they were completely, utterly happy, for a moment. Just one moment, but it was enough. The sound woke Ayla from a deep, dreamless sleep. It was alien, mechanical, a rhythmic chopping noise that cut through the natural symphony of the forest like a blade. Whoomp, 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 whoomp. Her eyes flew open. A helicopter. "Sebastian, wake up!" she hissed, shaking him violently. "Wake up!" He shot up, instantly awake, his body coiled with the reflexive tension of survival. "What? What is it?" Ayla didn't answer. She just pointed at the sky. And there it was, a dark shape against the low-hanging morning clouds, cutting a path through the sky. Rescue. They scrambled to their feet, stumbling into a small clearing, waving their arms frantically, their voices raw as they screamed. "Here! We're down here!" The helicopter flew past, disappearing behind the dense canopy. Ayla's heart plummeted, a cold, heavy stone in her chest. No. Please. No. But then, it returned. It was circling, lower this time, the sound of its rotors echoing through the valley. They were searching. "They can't see us," Sebastian said, his mind already working. "We need something visible, something that stands out." Ayla's eyes darted around the clearing and landed on the tattered remains of their makeshift backpacks. The lining was a faded, but still distinct shade of emergency red. The packs. Working together, they tore the fabric into the largest strips they could manage, spreading them out on the damp ground of the clearing, anchoring the corners with heavy stones. They created a crude, desperate X on the forest floor. And then they waited, their heads tilted back, their hearts pounding in unison with the beat of the rotors. The helicopter made another pass, then another. Ayla held her breath, her hand gripping Sebastian's so tightly her knuckles were white. And then it began to descend. The moment her feet touched the metal floor of the helicopter cabin, Ayla felt a wave of dizziness so profound she almost collapsed. A rescuer in a flight suit helped her to a seat, and Sebastian slid in beside her, his hand never leaving hers. It was over. 2 weeks. 14 days lost in a green hell that had nearly consumed them. And now, it was over. A paramedic began checking them over, his voice a calm, professional drone as he asked about injuries, dehydration, and shock. But Ayla barely heard him. Her entire focus was on Sebastian, on the feel of his hand in hers, on the unbelievable reality of the vibrating floor beneath her feet. What happens now? The thought was a terrifying whisper in the back of her mind. The forest had been their world, a brutal but simple reality. They had been partners, equals, lovers. But what were they back in the real world? As if sensing her thoughts, Sebastian squeezed her hand. "Nothing changes," he whispered, his voice low and for her ears only. But they both knew that wasn't true. Everything was about to change. The landing at the hospital was a descent from one kind of chaos into another. The moment the helicopter doors slid open, they were assaulted by a barrage of flashing lights and shouting voices, cameras, reporters, microphones shoved in their faces. Mr. Ashbourne, over here. How did you survive? Is it true there were other victims on the flight?" Sebastian, his face a grim mask, tried to push through the throng, his arm a protective shield around Ayla. But a reporter from a notorious gossip website, known for her tenacity, broke through the security line. "Mr. Ashbourne," she called out, her voice sharp and piercing. "Sources say you were stranded with a junior employee. Can you comment on the nature of your relationship during your time in the wilderness?" Ayla felt Sebastian go rigid beside her. This was it, the moment of truth. She braced herself for the denial, the minimization, the carefully worded corporate statement designed to protect his reputation. It was the logical thing to do, the Sebastian Ashbourne thing to do. Instead, he stopped. He turned, facing the sea of cameras squarely. The flashes illuminated the exhaustion on his face, the new scars, the dirt still smudged on his cheek. He looked less like a billionaire CEO and more like a warrior returning from a long and brutal war. "Ayla Morin saved my life," he said, his voice clear and steady, ringing with an authority that silenced the entire crowd. "If I am standing here today, it is because of her and her alone. She is the bravest, most intelligent, and most incredible woman I have ever met." He paused, his eyes finding Ayla's in the midst of the media storm. "And I love her." The silence that followed was absolute, a collective, stunned intake of breath. Ayla froze, her own heart stopping in her chest, the world narrowing to the look in his eyes. And then the chaos exploded again. But this time, it was different. Sebastian ignored the renewed frenzy of questions. He took her hand, lifting it in front of the cameras, in front of the entire world. And he smiled. A real, brilliant, unguarded smile. A few quiet days later, the world had been reduced to the 4 sterile walls of a private hospital room. Sebastian was recovering, the IV drip in his arm a testament to the ordeal they had endured. Ayla sat in a chair beside his bed, a silent, constant presence. They hadn't spoken much about his public declaration. They didn't need to. It hung in the air between them, a new and permanent reality. The door to the room opened without a knock. A man entered, his presence instantly sucking the warmth from the air. He was older, dressed in a suit even more impeccably tailored than Sebastian's had ever been, his eyes the color of ice chips. Ayla recognized him immediately from company galas and board meeting photos. Richard Ashbourne, Sebastian's uncle, the architect of the man she used to hate. "Get out," Richard said, his voice low and dismissive. He didn't even look at Ayla, his gaze fixed on his nephew with cold fury. Sebastian pushed himself up against the pillows, his jaw tightening. "She stays." Richard closed the door with a soft, menacing click. "Have you lost your mind completely?" he hissed. "A public declaration? For a—" He gestured vaguely in Ayla's direction, his eyes finally flicking over her with undisguised contempt. "For an employee?" "Ayla is not an employee," Sebastian countered, his voice dangerously calm. "Of course she is. And thanks to your little press conference, the company's stock dropped 3 points. The investors are spooked. The board is questioning your stability, suggesting you're suffering from some post-traumatic delusion." Sebastian swung his legs over the side of the bed, standing to face his uncle, ignoring the pull of the IV line in his arm. "Then let them question." Richard blinked, for the first time looking genuinely shocked. "What?" "You heard me. I'm done living my life for the board, for the investors, for you." "Sebastian." "No." His voice was iron. "You had your turn. You spent 17 years molding me in your image. You turned me into something cold and calculating and utterly alone." His voice cracked on the last word. "I will not be that man anymore." Ayla watched, her heart swelling with a fierce, protective pride. This was it, the final wall crumbling. Richard's gaze shot to Ayla, his expression curdling with disgust. "This is her fault. She's manipulated you. This is Stockholm Syndrome, a shared trauma bond. You went through something terrible together, and now you think it's love, but—" "I know what I feel," Sebastian interrupted, his voice cutting like glass. "And for the first time in my life, I am choosing what matters, not what's expected." Richard let out a short, bitter laugh. "How noble! But let's be practical. Without me, you have no company. I control 40% of the voting shares. More than enough to have you removed if I rally the board." "Then do it." The silence that followed was absolute. Even Ayla held her breath. The two men stared each other down, a silent battle of wills waged across the sterile hospital room. Richard's eyes narrowed. "You're bluffing. Try me." Finally, Richard took a step back, his face a mask of cold fury. "You will regret this, Sebastian." "Probably," Sebastian agreed, a weary resignation in his voice. "But at least I'll regret it while living my own life." Richard shot one last venomous look at Ayla, a look that promised retribution, and then turned and walked out, slamming the door behind him. The moment the door closed, Sebastian swayed, the bravado draining out of him. Ayla was at his side in an instant, her hands on his arms, steadying him. "Are you okay?" "Yeah, He looked at her, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and exhilarating relief. "I think I just threw away my entire life's work." "No, you didn't," she said softly, her hands moving to cup his face, forcing him to meet her gaze. "You chose. You chose you." "And what if I chose wrong?" he whispered, the fear raw and real. "Then we build something new," she said, her voice unwavering. "Together." "Together," he repeated, the word tasting foreign and wonderful on his tongue. He leaned into her touch, a slow, genuine smile spreading across his face, a smile of pure, unadulterated freedom. "Together. I like the sound of that." Ayla smiled back, her heart aching with love for this new, brave man in front of her. But in the back of her mind, a question lingered, a shadow in the bright light of their victory. They had survived the forest. But could they survive the world? 2 weeks later, Sebastian arranged to meet Ayla at the small independent coffee shop near their old office building. It was a place steeped in memory, of rushed morning coffees, of Ayla sketching designs on napkins, of Sebastian striding in and out without a word, a cold specter of authority. But this time everything was different. He was no longer her boss. She was no longer his employee. They were something else. A question mark. Ayla arrived 5 minutes early, her stomach a knot of nervous energy. He was already there, sitting at a small table by the window, 2 steaming cups of coffee waiting. When he saw her, his entire face lit up with a smile so genuine and unguarded it took her breath away. And in that instant, Ayla knew. They were going to be okay. "I have a proposition for you," Sebastian said after the initial greetings, his voice lacking its old corporate edge. It was warmer, more relaxed. Ayla took a tentative sip of her coffee, the familiar bitterness a grounding sensation. "Okay. I'm starting a new company," he said, his eyes clear and direct. "Something smaller, something that's mine. No uncle, no board, no weight of the Ashbourne name." He paused, leaning forward slightly, his intensity focused entirely on her. "And I want you to be my partner." Ayla nearly choked on her coffee. "What?" "You heard me. A 50-50 split. Equal say, equal profit. Real partners." Sebastian, I don't know the first thing about running a business," she stammered, her mind reeling. "But you know about design. You know how to create things that are beautiful and innovative. And more importantly," he reached across the table, his hand covering hers, his touch warm and firm. "You know me, and I trust you more than I trust anyone on this planet." "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Because in the forest, you taught me that I don't have to do everything alone. You saved my life in more ways than one, Ayla." He squeezed her hand. "Let me do this. With you." Ayla looked at the man across from her. This wasn't the cold CEO she had hated. It wasn't even the desperate survivor from the wilderness. This was just Sebastian, hopeful, real, vulnerable, the man she loved. "I have one condition," she said finally, a slow smile spreading across her face. His eyes lit up. "Anything. We do it our way. No cutting corners, no ruthless deals. We build something we can be proud of, something that matters." Sebastian's smile widened, reaching his eyes. It was the smile she had come to know so well, the one that was just for her. "I wouldn't expect anything less." They sealed the deal not with a contract, but with a handshake across the small table. And then, because they were them and they couldn't help it, he leaned across the table and sealed it again with a soft, promising kiss that tasted of coffee and new beginnings. In the months that followed, Aura Designs was born. Their office was a tiny rented space with second-hand furniture and a coffee machine that sputtered more than it brewed. It was a world away from the polished marble and glass of Ashbourne Industries, but it was theirs. They worked side by side, long hours filled with the easy rhythm of a true partnership. They argued passionately over font choices and color palettes. They celebrated small victories with cheap pizza and beer. They fell into a routine that blended their professional and personal lives seamlessly, ending most days tangled together on her small apartment sofa, exhausted but happy. Slowly, Ayla realized something profound. She hadn't just survived the forest. She had been reborn in it. The quiet, invisible designer was gone. In her place was a confident woman, a business owner, a partner. She had found her voice. She had found her place. One night, working late in their small office, surrounded by sketches and fabric samples, Sebastian paused, his pen hovering over a blueprint. "Ayla?" she answered, not looking up from her own work. Are you happy? The question was so simple, so direct, it made her stop. She looked up at him, really looked at him. She saw the faint scars that would forever be a map of their survival. But she also saw the peace in his eyes, the lightness in his posture. She saw the man he had allowed himself to become. Yes, she said, her voice soft but certain. I am. And it was the absolute truth. But as he smiled and turned back to his work, a question that had been lingering in the back of her mind for months surfaced again. A quiet, persistent whisper. They were partners in business, lovers in life. But where exactly was this all going? 6 months to the day after their rescue, Sebastian took Ayla back to the mountains. Not to the same forest, never again to that forest, but to a national park a few hours from the city with well-marked trails and breathtaking panoramic views. Why are we here? Ayla asked as they hiked, the crisp autumn air invigorating, the path beneath their feet solid and safe. You'll see, was all he said, a mysterious, gentle smile playing on his lips. He led her to a clearing at the summit, a rocky outcrop that overlooked a sprawling valley below. The setting sun was painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange, pink, and deep violet. It was so beautiful it made her chest ache. Sebastian stopped and turned to face her. And in that moment, Ayla saw it. He was nervous. His hands were fidgeting slightly, and there was a vulnerable, hopeful tension in his eyes that made her own heart skip a beat. When the plane went down, he began, his voice low and serious, his gaze fixed on her. The only thought in my head was that I had wasted my entire life. Ayla held her breath, her hand instinctively finding his. I had the money, the success, the power, he continued, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. But I had nothing that truly mattered, no one who really knew me. He took both of her hands in his. And then there was you. Suddenly, I wasn't alone anymore. You saw me, the real me, the broken parts and all, and you didn't run away. You stayed. You fought for me. You saved me. He let go of one of her hands, and the world seemed to slow down. He dropped to one knee on the rocky ground. Ayla's heart stopped. I don't know what the future holds for us, Ayla, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know if the company will be a massive success or a spectacular failure. I don't know what challenges the world is going to throw at us. He pulled a small, simple velvet box from his pocket. But I know one thing with absolute certainty. I don't want to face any of it without you. He opened the box. Inside, nestled on the dark velvet, was a ring. It wasn't a large, ostentatious diamond like the ones she'd seen on the wives of his former colleagues. It was a simple, elegant band with a single, perfect, clear stone that caught the last rays of the setting sun and splintered them into 1,000 tiny rainbows. Ayla Morin, he said, his voice breaking, his heart in his eyes. Will you marry me? She couldn't speak. Tears were streaming down her face, blurring the beautiful man kneeling before her. So she did the only thing she could. She dropped to her knees in front of him, threw her arms around his neck and kissed him with all the love in her soul. Is that a yes? He asked when they finally pulled apart, laughing through his own tears. Yes, she whispered, her voice choked with happiness. Yes. 1,000 times yes. He slid the ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. And in that moment, on top of a mountain with the world stretching out beneath them, everything finally, beautifully made sense. Their company grew. It never became a corporate giant like Ashbourne Industries, but it became something better. It was solid, respected, and honest. It was theirs. They married a year later in a small, intimate ceremony in a sun-dappled garden, surrounded only by the people who truly mattered. Ayla's grandmother, her face glowing with pride. A few close friends who had watched their journey unfold. There was no press, no board members, no pretense. Later, At the reception, as the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the small gathering, Sebastian pulled her away for a quiet moment. They stood by a small, bubbling fountain, the sound of the water, a peaceful counterpoint to the distant laughter. "I have something for you," he said, a mischievous glint in his eye. He reached into the pocket of his tuxedo and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. It was a cocktail napkin. "Our final contract," he said, handing it to her. She unfolded it. On it, written in his sharp, decisive handwriting, was a single sentence. The final clause, Party A, Sebastian, and Party B, Ayla, hereby agree to love, honor, and survive whatever comes next, together, for the rest of their lives. Below it were 2 lines, already signed with his name. Ayla laughed, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy that echoed in the twilight. "This is the best contract you've ever written," she said. He produced a pen from his pocket. "Shall we make it official?" Leaning against the cool marble of the fountain, she signed her name beside his. He took the napkin from her, folded it carefully, and placed it back in his pocket, close to his heart. "Binding for a lifetime," he said, his voice full of a love so deep it was bottomless. He pulled her into his arms and kissed her, a slow, sweet kiss that held all the promises of their future. Their story had started with a fall from the sky, a brutal game of survival against impossible odds. But it had ended here, with a promise written on a napkin, a testament to the beautiful, undeniable fact that sometimes you have to lose everything to find the one thing that truly matters.